Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
I'm Stuart Holbrook, and welcome to The Curious Collector. It's episode 33. Today's title, Generally Excellent, Condition and Collectibles. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but first of all, my usual updates as to location and what's been going on. I'm coming to you with this episode from Toronto, Canada. And on a snowy day, I should say. Yes, the first snow of the year for me. And I encountered it in, of course, Canada. I had to drive from Buffalo, New York yesterday through a snowstorm, but arrived here fit and safe and looks beautiful out there, but it's cold and winter has arrived. So doing a doll talk up here and seeing a few collectors as well in Toronto area in the GTA, as they call it, the Greater Toronto, whatever it is. I don't know. But anyway, so happy to be here and happy to be with all of you today. I just came from Buffalo, where I did a doll talk with the Western New York Doll Club. That was fantastic. They have a great membership there. Everybody was there with this wonderful lunch. Actually served a Thanksgiving luncheon. I don't know why. I'm like, it's not Thanksgiving yet, but I was kind of glad because I actually have to be gone for Thanksgiving and over working in Europe. So it's one of the few times I have to get over and do some appointments that have been waiting for me there because of all the doll talk. So I actually had my Thanksgiving in Buffalo on Saturday and had a great time. They were such a fun group. There was this one lady. Oh my gosh. It was the most hilarious moment, I think, at one of my table talks. Her cell phone kept going off and kept ringing over and over, and she was completely flustered. And it was an old style flip phone, too, which I was laughing at. And she was completely flustered, and she didn't know how to silence it or turn it off. And it was just making everybody crazy in the room. And she apologized. And she said, I'm so sorry. She said, I secretly escaped the nursing home and I didn't tell them. And they're calling, looking for me. I know it. They can't find me. And so I told her, you know what? Everybody burst out laughing. And I said, listen, I tell you what, after this doll talk, I'm heading to Canada. If you want, we can escape together. Get in my truck and we'll go. And she said, let's go. Let's do it. So yes, I've arrived stealth. No, she didn't come with me. Don't worry about that. But yes, a true story. When you enter into Canada, I always say you got to put on your polite hat. Canadians are wonderful. I love Canadians, and they are the most polite people you will ever meet. And that includes while driving. Tammy, have you ever driven in Canada?
I've never been to Canada, but that's on my list.
Are you kidding? Oh, okay, well, let me give you a lesson about driving in Canada. Okay. Do not honk your horn.
Oh, all right.
Ever. Now, I know you're California. You don't really honk that often like we do on the East Coast, right?
Correct.
But let me just tell you that I remember going into Vancouver once, and I was driving in Vancouver, and the light turned green, and the person just sat there. So I put it on the horn, and oh my gosh, mothers were clutching their babies. People were pointing at me.
Oh my
there
gosh.
was horror on the streets of this man who dared honk his horn at somebody. They thought I was a killer.
Oh,
and so that's what I learned. You just don't do that in Canada. So there you go. There's your lesson for today.
I like Canada better now. I've got to go.
Okay. All right. So I also want to, in this opening, want to say a few words about somebody that we actually lost in the doll world this week and just give a little memory of her and a chance for people to kind of reflect on who I believe was really a giant in the world of dolls over the past 40 years. And that's Louise Hedrick of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And I know for many of you out there, the second I say Louise Hedrick, you know right away who it is and may have taken one of her incredible sewing workshops she did around the country or read her books or met her in person at conventions and doll shows and auctions. And she was an amazing character. She did pass away last week. And unfortunately, we lost one of the true great icons in the world of dolls and one of my favorite people. I spent many, many days in her living room over the years. She would never let you leave without a full meal on the table and great conversation. She was the most spirited, fantastic, feisty and fun person you would ever meet. And I know that her memory and her legacy and her contributions to the world of dolls is going to be lasting for generations. She left the doll world a better place because of her. And so rest in peace, Louise Hedrick. We're all going to miss you. With that, let's get right into the discussion for the day. And that's called Generally Excellent. Condition in dolls and condition in collectibles in general, and what it all means. And that is, it's clearly one of the topics that every collector is faced with day to day in their decision making as to purchasing, pricing, and what they're comfortable with as far as the conditions of a particular item. And so it's a really provocative topic, I should say, but I think it is an important one for us to discuss. I want to start off by saying, first of all, that, as in everything you hear on any of my podcasts or any podcasts or anything you read or anything everybody tells you, ultimately you have to make decisions for yourself. And when I'm talking to you here about certain concepts and ideas of my lessons that I've learned over these years in the hobby and watching everything going on from the podium, from experience, from living rooms, they are my opinions, and they are just that. And ultimately, people can have opposing opinions or opposing approaches to their own collecting that may differ from some of my ideas. And I encourage that. Everyone should frame their hobby and their passion and their pursuits in a way that they're the most comfortable with. And we'll talk a lot about that later on from the concept and idea of critical thinking, which I think is something that's being lost in the world today a little bit. So I'm going to help you with that and talking through, because I think this particular topic is very, very much steeped in the idea of the need for critical thinking. That is, you're deciding what is good for you and breaking through the chatter. So generally excellent. What does this mean? So there's a great story behind this. So in the 1970s, late 1970s, Florence, as a young cataloger and really just a few years into the business of dolls and doing auctions and doing her now famous descriptions of a genre that she was still very heavily learning about, she was struggling with the idea or the concept of calling something pristine or perfect or even just the one word excellent. I mean, we're dealing with a topic of antiques, items that were made 150 years ago in some cases. And how could something be perfect? How could something be pristine? And in essence, is that really at the core of what it is you're after? These are objects that are old, really old. These are objects that were made in an imperfect environment. They were not mass produced on an assembly line with intensive quality control. They were often hand done. And there are so many different genres and different aspects of each doll, different categories, different mediums, that everything varies from one thing to the next. So ultimately, her feelings were that there needs to be a better all-encompassing term that would be more understandable to people. So she came out with the concept of generally excellent. That is, for an object that's this old, played with, passed through generations, made in an imperfect environment, sometimes hand done, it's pretty generally excellent. I'm actually thinking of getting a t-shirt that says generally excellent. And when people ask me, how are you doing today, Stuart? I'm going to say, well, I'm generally excellent, I guess, which really kind of describes all of us. I mean, we don't always say we're excellent. Everybody, well, some days you may, but everybody has a little bit of stuff that's bothered them during the day or things that they wish hadn't happened at that moment. But overall, you're doing all right, given all these different factors, because your days are different. And so generally excellent, I think, is a great term for everything. And I think we need to start using it more often just in regular life. So generally excellent, I thought, was really a stroke of brilliance. Now, at the time, there was a lot of pushback on this term. People were fighting it all the time and telling her, oh, well, wait a minute. What are you hiding by not calling it excellent or not calling it perfect? What are you not telling us? And it wasn't that she wasn't telling you anything along those lines. She was just simply saying, again, generally, it is excellent for an object that is an antique. And that, I think, was the moment that it began to change people's idea and understanding that that is right. You don't have perfection in an antique necessarily. And should you? Part of the beauty of an antique is the age, is the what Europeans sometimes refer to as the patina of an antique. So I actually love it. And over the years, people began to accept and understand it. And now it's unbelievable how many people use this term in their research and writing and cataloging. And you see it repeated everywhere. But it was Florence who came up with this. It was a courageous move. And I really do love it. And I think it explains perfectly how we should probably first start to look at antiques. And that is to understand that they are an antique. I remember a quote from John Darcy Noble. Many of you might remember him from way back in the day, who did some wonderful books in the early days of collecting, I think in the 60s, 70s. And there was a quote in there that I had read years ago, and I'm paraphrasing this, so please, I don't know if it's exact, but it was something along the lines of, I feel sorry for antique dolls that are so perfectly preserved and pristine. And the meaning of that was basically, it seems like they weren't loved. They have no story to tell. They were just put in a box, wrapped up, and never touched and enjoyed. And ultimately, when we're dealing with objects that are playthings, in this case, there is a certain beauty and aspect of meaning when they come with maybe a few little blemishes here, a few little wear marks there, that you know, okay, this doll was truly enjoyed over the years, and it had a journey, just like us, just like our own human experience. And these are three-dimensional objects that represent the human experience. So ultimately, just like us, we have flaws and things. I have a few scars on my head from head injuries that I can think back when I see them in the mirror and remember, gosh, I never want to relive that day again. But those are meaningful. And it shows that it's a life well lived. So ultimately, I like that quote from John Darcy Noble. I'll throw in my own quote that I always say at the auctions. This one you could take as one of my famous yogiism type things that I say. Well, famous, I don't want to say they're famous, but I would say the eye rolling that goes on is typically more of a reaction. But I always say when we have a doll that maybe has a little flaw or a little something on it that's mentioned in the catalog, I always say, I'd rather own a beautiful doll with a flaw than an ugly doll that's perfect. So you can take that as you want. All right. So condition. Let's talk about it. Does condition matter? Well, of course it does. It also should be understood that condition is going to be subjective. And that was a big part of the generally excellent term, and Florence is utilizing that subjective comes into this all the time. One person's comfort level may be another person's discomfort level, let's call it. And so it always is very subjective as we are looking at dolls. I know that for years, especially back in the olden days of the golden age of collecting in that 1970s, 80s, 90s period, there was a very hardcore pressed movement that there are perfect dolls and there are damaged dolls. And that's pretty much it. There's no in between. But I think we have grown out of that. We have definitely evolved over the years to understand there are many, many different nuances of condition that have an effect or don't have an effect. And a lot of that will be subjective from one collector to the next. And we'll talk about that later on, in that try not to, in your own collecting, judge for others their comfort level, because it may be vastly different. So we have to respect each other and our own choices. So the first part of this discussion, it's very important to break down and realize that every category of doll is going to have a different criteria of condition expectations by serious collectors within that genre. So there is no uniformity in the expectations of condition as you move from one different type or genre of doll to the other. Everything will have differences. And a lot of it is the material they're made of. It could be the age. It could be the rarity level. All of these things are going to factor in. So if you collect French dolls, clearly, the criteria is going to be very different than if you collect English woodens or if you collect composition dolls of the 1930s. So they're all going to have their own collector consciousness in the area of condition and the expectations of how you typically find them. And that's something we'll talk about later on. As some of these may age over time, those expectations can also change. So I want to kind of break down a few of these here so we can talk about how collectors might tend to look at these different. So we can start with early dolls, English woodens as an example, or very early Grodner dolls or continental wood dolls. And clearly you have age that's become a huge factor with these. I mean, many of these dolls are, dare I say, 350 years old in some cases, with the earliest of the English woodens, and they're made of wood. So they're durable in the sense that they don't have big cracks like you might find with a bisque doll, but they are going to obviously have wear. And I find that it's far more understood in the collecting circles of that genre to expect that there is wear to a lot of these dolls. And I almost think with some of the English woodens, again, going back to John Darcy Noble's quote, that considering the age of them, considering that they were playthings, that it would be almost against the grain, no pun intended, because they're wood dolls. That was a pretty good one, I have to admit. It could go against the grain of ever expecting or wanting even perfection in that essence of one that looked like it just literally came out of a box on Christmas morning in 1720. So it's virtually impossible, and it's not what collectors really are necessarily, I think, looking for. Now, are there things they are looking at? For sure. Obviously, the presence, and we're going to talk a lot about that later on in this podcast when I talk to you about how to assess dolls for yourself in these particular genres. But the presence of that doll, the painting of that doll, does it pop? Does it stand out? The costume, obviously, on these early English woodens are vitally important. And all of these things are going to go into the factors that a collector looks at them. And we're going to talk later on as well about the steps of where you should look first. Should you look for negatives first or positives first? Well, clearly you should look for the positives first, because ultimately you want to know, will I love that doll? So looking at the overall presence, looking at the whole package in general, the costume, the body, how does it stand? How's the size for you, for your collection? Does that face really pop? How's the wig? All of these things, I'm looking at this from a positive standpoint of the overall presentation, and that's where you start. And with English woodens and any of the early wood dolls, it very much is the best starting point of your inspection, let's call it. And so from there, you can look deeper in perhaps deciding, is there restoration? Because you do have work that's been done on some of these English woodens over the years that could potentially impact some collectors' perception of originality. Could be a light little touch-up of a nose scuff or something along those lines. But, I'm finding more and more that collectors of these early dolls are also accepting some of those things in a far more prevalent manner than they were 40, 50 years ago, because their dolls are hard to find and they're really old. And there are some things that occasionally maybe look better if they have a little bit of a touch-up. But you have to judge that for yourself. And again, that's getting into the subjective aspect of your collecting. And overall, the positives may very well outweigh any negative that you may find, like a little bit of a touch-up on the nose, something along those lines. So that's why I always say go to the positive first, then you can maybe look at things that subjectively bother you or that you really look for in the dolls that you like to own, and make your decision from there. So that will naturally take you to a next level of doll, and that's the early porcelains. And it's so interesting to me that in every one of these categories, there are particularities of their manufacturing and their place in history as to what conditions may be accepted or not. So on these dolls, clearly, and I'm going to talk about hairlines and damages and chips and things along those lines. And when we get into the French and German bisque, so I'm going to leave that for that particular category. But with the early porcelains, you obviously are, again, start with the positives and then look for anything else that may affect them. Now, one of the things that's really interesting in particular about early porcelains is that a lot of them, as you know, historically, were generally shipped over as heads, and many of them, the bodies were made either by stores or by the owners or whatever through history. And in that respect, bodies, which become extremely important, I think, from the overall package of a doll when you get into French and German bisque, may have a bit less of an impact of a negative. Now, certainly, if you can find an example of an early porcelain on an articulated wood body with the bisque lower porcelain arms, I mean, clearly that is a uber positive thing, I mean, to find it. But if you find a really rare KPM, fabulous head, but it's on a body that is, I don't know, it's old, maybe of the period, but it's not quite rich or adds much to it, people will still buy it. It's not going to have a massive deterrent on the value, like you would if you found a Gemot Triste on a German Sonnenberg body, as a random example that just popped into my head, and we'll talk about that more. So ultimately, they may accept a little bit more on the body aspect with these early porcelains. So you start again, you look at the overall package. Does it pop? What's the painting like? How's the presence? Does it have a rare hairstyle? How's the costume on it? Because a lot of these early porcelains came in early costumes that kind of bridge the gap between the early Grodner dolls, early wood dolls of the Continental period in the early 1800s up into the classic golden age of the 1860s and on. So they can have early costumes on there that they can be quite valuable in themselves as well. So looking at those positives, and then you can inspect the porcelain and you can look for any damages or anything you see on that doll that is, again, subjective to you as to how much it will affect you. That would take you into another similar period of time getting into this 1850s to 1870s, but Americana, this time American dolls. Now, keep in mind, you were in a different country entirely and a different manufacturing platform. A lot of them were done in small cottage industry type doll making families. They were done by very small firms, upstarts like Izana Walker is a great example. They were commercially made, but in a very, very different atmosphere than you would find going on in France and Germany at the time. As such, there is a certain rusticness about these dolls that ultimately lend themselves to the patina of an antique, and I think that's part of the charm. I know a lot of Izana Walker collectors who actually like original finish, though albeit worn, because the wear adds to the charm. The doll was loved, and they are representing early Americana, and there is a little bit of rusticness to these dolls. But then they're going to look at things like repainting. And again, like the early English woodens, they will accept a little bit of touch-up here and there on these dolls, as long as it's noted, and they're not going to completely turn their heads away from them because, A, they're really rare, and we'll talk about how rarity can impact decision-making and condition and change your expectations and change your subjective reasoning as to whether it works for you. So they are far more accepting to a little bit of touch-ups and definitely to wear on things like an Izana Walker or cloth folk art doll. You know, the list goes on. That pretty much gives you a general idea of that genre. And it leads us into the big one, French and German bisque. And this is where we see a very, very unique level of scrutiny that is done to these dolls on multifaceted levels. The first and the most critical one is that everybody is always inspecting the bisque. And it is absolutely a part of the buying pattern for these dolls by every collector. Your perception is, and you all say this, does it have perfect bisque? Well, let me start by saying, again, though these were now being manufactured in a bit more of a controlled environment compared to, say, early English woodens or even early porcelain dolls, there is ultimately a hand-done aspect to them in the painting and other things, and there was less of a perfected quality control as you might see with hard plastics of the 50s that were manufactured more assembly line and a lot of times with machinery. And so ultimately, I don't still believe that there is ever such a thing as perfection with a French and German Bisque doll. They ultimately are all going to have little somethings here and there if you look hard enough. So again, the same approach with this. You need to first look for the positives, and then you can begin to search deeper into where your comfort level will be. And I want to talk about the different areas of French and German Bisque dolls that you will face in your scrutiny for your own collection. You know, the first one is obviously a clear-cut, absolute, it's there damage. You see it. It's a big chip out of the crown rim that is coming out that you can see it with the naked eye. You put it in your case 10 feet away and you can say, oh, that doll has a big chip in it. So obviously, that's going to be a situation where a collector is going to judge, do I want to get that restored or do I even want that? It's going to have a fairly impactful moment on the demand of that doll, depending on the rarity and depending on the particular needs of the collector who might be interested in it. So that's the big one. But where it gets really nuanced is when you start getting into hairlines that are apparent or the faintest of hairlines, which I think are two very different things. An obvious hairline, a big line coming right down the front of the face, is going to have an impact. But here's where I think we start stepping out of line of expectations on these dolls, given their age, given the environment they were made in, and given the years of families and collectors that they passed down through, is the faintest of hairlines. Now, you know these lines. These are the ones that the person puts all the lights into the head. And I mean, my gosh, they have headlamps and hand lamps and everything imaginable shoved inside this head, searching desperately, almost like they want to find it, something on that doll. Now, I would say that ultimately, if you really want to look for something, if you're determined to find something, you probably could eventually see something, because you know there's those little lines that you can see just with the light in the head where you tip your shoulders off to the left side and switch your hips over to the right and lift one leg up and have it just tilted where the natural light's coming in through the window. And there it is. Wait. And this is my favorite. It comes and it goes. You got to hold it just right and just move it. And then you see it, and then it goes away, but then it comes back. This is where I think we've kind of crossed the line of, I don't want to say ridiculous, but definitely the point of being a little bit overeager in the idea of expecting this perfection that is just not going to be on them. Look, as I said, if you look hard enough, you're going to find something on these dolls. I mean, it's only natural. Now, you'll hear people argue with this, and I've had this argument, and I respect people's opinions. If it bothers you, hey, you do you. That's my motto for every collector out there. If it bothers you, you want to look for that kind of stuff, go for it. But ultimately, I would say this. You're never going to see that in your case. And I don't think your friends who come to look at your collection say, oh, I love that doll. Now, can I inspect it, please? And put their flashlights in and say, oh, well, now I don't love it. I can see just tilting it to the left and to the right and moving it in the right sunlight that I can see a little something inside that head. I don't think they're going to do that either. And you'll probably still love that doll and love how it interacts with your other dolls. And if it has all the other factors that you should be looking for from the positive slant, the positive angle of approaching inspection, and that is maybe it has original costume, pristine body, has a wonderful presence, beautiful original wig. Maybe it has antique Jamo jewelry as an example, all of these other things. Why would that other thing factor? Now, you will hear people argue and say this, the favorite line I was going to tell you about before until I got sidetracked, as I often do. And that is that, oh, well, it may be very minimal now. You can only see it under certain light, but it could grow. Now, I don't know where this came out of, but look, if you bang the head against the wall or you drop it on the hardwood floor, could the doll damage from there? Sure. But The reality is, don't drop it on the floor or bang the doll against the wall. It's pretty simple. If you just keep the doll in your cabinet and take good care of it, well, let me just say this. Over my many, many decades in this business, the only miraculous growing hairline I have ever seen is my own. And if you know me and know my hair, you'll understand that joke. So ultimately, I don't believe in that necessarily when dolls are properly taken care of, that you're going to see anything that is remotely faint, that you can only see with multiple lights inside the head, is going to somehow make it more susceptible, only if you drop it or bang it against the wall, as I said. So I think there is a very fine line, no pun intended again, between hairline and the faintest of hairlines. Actually, it's not even a fine line. It's a very vastly different line. And so you have to judge for yourself. And again, we'll talk about all the other factors that should go into your decision making. So then you have eye chips, and eye chips are very unique because some can be very, very minimal. Like you have to tilt the doll a certain way, and it's not even an eye chip. I should say that's not even an eye flake. It's more of a roughness around the eye. A tiny bit was rubbed away over the years or something along those lines. So you have those, which should be minimal impact, in my opinion, if I was collecting, because you really can't see them unless, again, you're lighting everything up, you're really looking at it closely, and you're tilting it in a certain way. And then there are those eye flakes or eye chips where the doll's standing in a case, you see it. And clearly that's going to have impact as well. And then you have inherent firing lines. And there are a lot of arguments over the years from collectors as to what is a firing line versus what is a hairline. And you have to judge it for yourself. It's not something you can necessarily teach. It's more something that you become accustomed to over the years and seeing, and you kind of understand, no, that's not really a hairline. You can tell that was in the making. That is, it doesn't come out of anything or go anywhere. It's a little dark line that was probably in the mold or in the making, dust, whatever. And again, is it aesthetic? I mean, it can be, if it's major, right on the front of the face, and it's very aesthetically damaging to the doll itself. Well, that's part of the presence, right? And that absolutely, for many collectors, will affect them in their decision as to whether they want that doll or how much they will pay for it. So that, again, has to be judged as a different type of thing than a hairline or a crack or something along those lines. Ultimately, it is original to the doll. But does that really matter? If it's way up on the back of the head, very tiny, and again, you can barely see it, it shouldn't have any impact. If it's right on the front of the face, I obviously think it will. So then you get into other factors that, well, I think people nowadays do pay more attention to it, collectors today. But back in the 80s and 90s, they were so obsessed with the bisque that a lot of them forgot to look at the very basics of the body. Is the body original? Does it have repaint? Is it the right size? Is it the right age period? You know, on a Jameau example, is it an 1874 bébé, 1875 bébé, but the body is clearly something that looks like it might be like 1890. You know, all of these things, though there are nuances within that, in that you ultimately have different style bodies that could have come on a doll that is not as normal. Sure, that potential is there. But look at the bodies, look at the repaint, look at the size of it. Does it fit the doll properly? All of these things. And then unique bodies you have to take into factors because it breaks down even more. There are subcategories, and there's no uniformity even within French dolls or German dolls as to the different makers and how they made bodies. Like Bru, as an example, when you have a classic Bru body, leather body with the bisque arms, you want to look at those bisque arms and look at the fingers. Does it have a damaged finger? Now, this is a big one because it's really interesting. Serious Bru collectors look at the fingers and inspect them for restoration or damage. And in that sense, will make a determination of the effect based on their subjective thinking and their critical reasoning into what they like for their own collection. So there are some people that a little restored fingertip is not going to matter really much at all, especially if it has the face and it's a really rare size and maybe it's in an original Bru costume. That's going to have minimal impact. If it's 3 broken fingers, they're pretty prominent. Collectors are going to have a little bit more of an impact. I think, in that sense. But then it could be some of them are comfortable with getting it restored, having the fingers restored, or even displaying it with the hand stuck behind the back of another doll so nobody can see it. Again, all of these things will relate to the positive things that you are looking at. And so the last thing, clearly on a condition standpoint inspection, looking at the positives or the negatives of the particular costume. First, look at the positives. Is it a fabulous original costume? Is it couture level? There are cases where I joke about this, but I often say, buy that doll just for the costume, or that's the price of the costume, because that costume may be great. Maybe that head is flat. Maybe from a present standpoint, I should say, maybe it has a damage that's really prominent, but maybe it has a fabulous rare body and an incredible original couture costume. Maybe, again, as I mentioned before, with original jewelry, possibly Gemot jewelry. In those cases, sure, you're not going to pay perhaps the same price as if the head did not have that big damage right in the front of the face, but you certainly can look at this doll and see potential from the perspective of that costume, and that it has value, and it may be significant value in that regards, because costumes are becoming one of the most fought over and sought after areas within our genre. It's not just about figurative art in the object itself. Costumes have become almost as equally as important to the overall pursuit of history of that 19th century period, especially when we get into the French dolls. So it may be you pay as much as it takes to get it because that costume is fantastic. Which segues perfectly into the discussion of another new category, and that's 20th century cloth dolls. And a couple of examples of those might be Lenchies, obviously, from the 1920s and 30s, leading up into the 40s, 50s. Also Steiff dolls, too. Some of the, not bears, but the dolls that they produced, that the Marguerite Steiff Company produced in the early 20th century, which are very popular and sought after. Collectors of these are going to obviously not be looking for hairlines. I mean, you don't have that issue with cloth or felt, but they're going to be looking at other factors that will determine their collectability within their collection. And so the big one, obviously, we talked about costume. The costume is critical. Lenchies is a great example to talk about. You have fading. Typically, the doll was put in the windowsill and sat there for 25 years in California and the sunshine pouring in. That costume's going to be pretty faded. And that's going to be a deterrent for a lot of collectors, serious collectors of Lenchi. And you will find that it will heavily impact the price. But maybe that doll was beautifully preserved, wonderfully kept. And you've seen these Lenchies before. It's like, wow, when the color just pops. As you imagine when Lenchi firm first released this doll in random date 32, and it still has that incredible original color that pops. Those are going to be highly sought after and highly in demand. So they're going to be looking features like that. Are there replaced elements of the costume? And then the big one you'll always hear, and the only dolls you'll ever hear this particular question come up really, and that is, does it have any moth holes? Because you will find Lenchies occasionally that will have some moth holes or little wear holes in the costumes, and they will judge based on the location, the prominence of it. Maybe the costume really is pristine. Maybe the colors absolutely pop and are original, no fading, but it's got one tiny little moth hole. It is not going to be that big of a deal from my history of working with the Lenchi collectors. But if it's faded and it has moth holes all over, you're taking it down another notch. These are the things that you tend to look for. But of course, again, as I've said, the rarity factor is going to come into play. If it's a Lenchi that nobody has ever seen before, one that nobody even knew existed, and it comes out into the market and the costume is a bit faded and there's a couple of moth holes, it's going to have and be less of a deterrent than you would find if it's an everyday Lenchi where you know in a few months you'll probably find another one that will absolutely be a very different type of circumstance in the 20th century cloth dolls. So that will go right into, obviously, composition dolls. And compositions are a big one because you do have an element. Again, you don't have hairlines, or I guess you can have chips potentially, but it's not really the same as you would find in a Bisque doll. But the big one on composition dolls is crazing and the level of crazing. Sometimes crazing can be very, very light and almost not noticeable in a general setting of your doll case. And sometimes crazing can be really prominent, like it's clearly there. And you get sometimes these splits that happen around eye areas that become aesthetically not as pleasing to the eye of these particular dolls. So people do tend to look for compositions that have a wonderful original finish to them, lacking any sort of crazing. Now, sometimes you'll have very, very light crazing that might be towards the back of the head or somewhere that's not really seen below the wig, and that may not affect people obviously as much. So there is that to contend with too. And again, it becomes very subjective to the composition collector. But interestingly enough, I didn't talk about this, but French dolls, German dolls as well, and the Bisque category, the costumes are important in the sense of a positive, but they're not as negatively looked upon if they are redressed appropriately. And it even could be a very nicely done costume of the style and fabrics that you would have found that were original to them. That is acceptable in that particular category. Obviously, you're going to pay significantly more when you're talking about a French doll in an original couture costume, but you're not going to completely pan a French doll that's beautifully redressed in an age-appropriate and style costume. With composition dolls, totally different. This is the moment, and you see it with cloth dolls as well, but this is the moment when you get into the 1920s and 30s that costumes become critical. Not just the condition of the costume, but the originality of the costume becomes a really vital criteria of having value and demand with serious collectors. I would say that for a lot of collectors in the composition genre, they are actually looking at the costume first and foremost, because here's the deal. If you have a composition that's heavily crazed, but it has a mint original costume and that costume is rare, that doll's still going to go. And serious collectors are still going to go after it. And you know why? I don't have to say it. Because the dolls themselves, there might be slight variations, but you're getting into more of a uniform production where you don't see as much difference in presence that you would with a French and German Bisque doll. So with the compositions, it would be very easy to buy a heavily crazed one if it's on a rare costumes, pay as much as you can to get it, and you just need to switch that costume to another composition that you have that doesn't have as good a costume and put it onto that one because it's essentially the same doll. It is the same doll, and there's not going to be a whole lot of difference in the overall presence of it. So that's where compositions become very nuanced in that sense. Tammy, you collect compositions.
Yes, I do.
All right. So is what I'm saying in your mind, I mean, be honest with me. Does it ring a bell to you? Does it sound like your line of thinking when you're collecting compositions? I mean, the first thing I guess I would ask you is, I know you love the Portrait F&B Historical series. They're what are they, 21 inches?
They're 20 inches.
Not the smaller ones, right?
The smaller ones are great. I don't want to knock them, but the rarity of the big ones, there being only 3 sets of 30, so a total of 90 in the world, that's the biggest draw. I love it.
I know you do. I know you're after them. So we've talked about it before in the podcast, but an example, there's one out there that comes up and it has a lot of crazing on it. In this particular case, are you going to say, no, I'm sorry, that has crazing?
Not on that doll. I have one who is very far from the quality that I usually buy. Her hair is out of the original set. Her original clothes are damaged. Her face paint is faded. But she's so rare that if I don't have her, I will probably never find one of the other 2 of her that at one point existed. So she is in my collection. She's been with me over 20 years.
Okay, so you basically agreed with me, and this is something we'll talk about a lot in the context of any doll, is if it's rare enough and it's probable that you'll never see another one, you're going to take it no matter how it is. And you're going to accept it no matter how it is. And composition dolls for sure fall into that category. What if you find one that you know you're going to see more in the future, but you find one with heavily crazing and you see a really rare costume on that? Would you buy it? just to get that costume?
That would be a weird situation for me because I call myself a purist. And my dolls, I focus on originality totally. And I'd be tempted because the costume would get my eye, but I've never felt right about, and this is just me, again, this is just how I work, about taking something from a doll that's not so great and putting it on another doll. To me, that just feels very strange. If they've made it this long with their original clothes, I just can't be the one to take them apart. So I will bet you I would walk away.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. It is very subjective, clearly. And,
totally.
One collector's concern may not be the other collector's concern. And I would say, ultimately, it's hard to really determine anyway whether that costume was even on that doll to begin with.
It's true.
And,
That's true.
And we don't know unless there was one particular face, and it's extremely rare, made for that particular costume. How do you know? Really don't.
I guess I'd be judging it simply from the overall condition of the doll. I look for some of the weirdest things, Stuart. I look for, especially with Shirley's and Ideal dolls and Madame Alexander's, the socks. Are the socks turned under or are the edges up? Because if they've been turned under, they've probably never been taken off. If the edges are up, they've been taken off because you can't get them back on the other way hardly.
Okay, you're making my head explode here. I think what this says is, and this is really interesting, there are a lot of people that probably say, oh, well, she's too picky or whatever. But no, that's okay. Again, you do you.
Yeah,
everybody's going to have their own subjective things that bother them or don't bother them. And so I think this is actually a really good conversation to have amongst others. And I think we need to allow people to do what they are comfortable with. On the same note, I would say, and we'll talk about this later on, Tammy, is that it's not your place to tell the other collector that they should do the same.
Oh, no, never.
That they should look at dolls the same. Interesting. Thanks for talking to me about this. So I always appreciate getting your perspective as a collector on here. So I'm not rambling on and trying to make it seem like I control the narrative here. And this is why I was talking about there's differing opinions on this, and we respect that and understand it. Thanks, Tammy.
Of course.
So that takes us into the final one, and that's, I'm putting in quotation, modern dolls. And it's so interesting to think, I just did an auction of Alexander's, and in the beginning I was talking about, before I started the auction, that my gosh, Alexander's have reached the point of the earliest examples really being classified as antiques. And so calling them modern dolls today still shows that I'm older and shows that they are really not modern anymore. Especially, I mean, there's clearly modern Alexanders that are made recently, but when you're getting back into the golden age of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and into the 60s, you're getting into a period where we're approaching age and antique and a different criteria that might be aligned with these dolls. However, when you talk about Alexander, Barbie, all of the dolls of that period, Ginny's, Nancy Ann's storybooks, and the list goes on, you're into now again where, similar to the composition dolls, now you'll have less issues with condition of the doll itself. You'll have coloring issues, different things along those lines. You'll have some wear to the doll, the vinyl or the hard plastic or something along those lines that people are going to look for, but they typically are going to be uniform in a sense, condition-wise, the dolls themselves. Not always, and I know people will argue with me on that, but I'm saying certainly more so than you would see with the 20th century cloth dolls, as an example. So a lot of the attention really is focused on the costumes. Alexander is a big one where costumes are essentially the really important thing. Now, Florence argues with me on this, and she says, no, Stuart, I look at the Alexanders differently. I'm looking at those faces, and there are some faces where the painting of it just really pops, and it really is crisp. And I get that. There are some examples like that you will find that it should be a really positive thing. However, the costumes are, I noticed over the years, where a lot of people really are focused on and wanting condition reports or seeing all sides of it or understanding that all the elements are original. There's nothing replaced. Is it crisp? Does it have any fading? All of these things. So costumes are where people are going to look for on these particular dolls. Far more so, again, as we go back and compare to like French and German Bisque, where the patina of an antique is ultimately ultimately accept it. We've gotten through some categories, and there's obviously other categories, many more. There's hundreds of categories in the world of figurative art that we can talk about, and each of them are going to have their own level of assessment by the serious collectors of those. But I wanted to move on to talk about the concept that I think is uniform across all of these categories in the decision-making process. And we've touched on it before, but I want to just reiterate that there's a very big difference. So let's talk about Bisque dolls again, because that's the big one that everybody tends to really heavily be focused on. So when we're talking about Bisque dolls and assessing our level of acceptance and condition, clearly a very significant criteria is going to be what is the doll itself. So it's not necessarily what is the damage, it's what's the doll. So an example, given the common nature of, let's take, I always pick on Bilos and everybody gets mad at me, but I'll pick on Bilos again. Why not? At least it's a doll everybody knows, but a Bilo, they know it because it's so common. There's a lot of Bilos out there. So obviously your criteria, though, you may have your set subjective listing of things that bother you, like what Tammy talked about, and they are your particular subjective criteria elements. But the doll itself will ultimately be the choice as to how high or low you want to go based on that criteria. So the Bilo, as I was talking about, obviously your level of acceptance on a Bilo is going to be exponentially different than on, let's say, a Brew Gourmand, okay? A very, very rare Brew patented bottle that you might see once every year or two come out onto the marketplace. So on a Bilo, you're going to want as pristine, though I hate using that word, as generally excellent as you can possibly get. And you're going to be looking at original costume. The body is absolutely clean and excellent and original. The head has a really beautiful quality to the bisque. It has a good presence, everything. You want that there. You're not probably going to accept or want anything, even with, we talked about the faintest of hairlines on the back of the head where you can only see with a light. You're probably even not going to want it with that. Why? Because there's just not much of a price differential otherwise. I mean, you're talking about, so you can get it with a little bit of a line on the back of the head for $10 or $20. Well, you can get a pristine one for maybe $100 to $150. So why would you bother? You might as well wait and get the really, really overall original and exceptional one. But the doll I used as the other side, the other coin, the Brew Gourmand, here is one where your level of acceptance, though you may have a formula that you think you adhere to, that formula is going to be broken. Now, no pun intended again. Third time today. I'm on a roll here with the puns. I don't know where they're coming from. But you are going to obviously accept things far more than you might even on a somewhat rare doll if it's a Brew Gourmand, because this may be your one chance in years to be able to go after that doll. And it may be wonderful original costume and may have a great presence, but lo and behold, it has a hairline on one leg and another little hairline on one of the lower bisque arms. So all of these things may mean nothing to you in the case of a Brew Gourmand. You're still going for it. It may have absolutely no impact. Now, will you find one eventually that does not have those particular lines on the feet or the arms? Sure, the potential is there, but ultimately you have opportunity right now. You have this doll, and if it's going within your wheelhouse of price and it doesn't overly bother you, you're going to go for it much differently than you would on a Bilo, which you might as well just wait for the pristine one. So I hope that makes sense in that not only do you set your standards, like Tammy talked about, she has certain things she looks for, but they are going to adjust up and down depending on the doll. So that leads to a big question. Do collectors go too far in obsessing about condition on antiques? And we certainly understand that there's different categories and so different levels of acceptance in these different categories. But overall, and I guess this probably rings true more with classic antiques. So Golden Age doll making, French German dolls, Bisque dolls, porcelain dolls Are collectors too eager to look for the negative rather than, as I mentioned before, overall starting with the positives? Do we obsess about them? I hate to use that word, but in some cases, I do believe that obsessing about the idea of condition is prevalent. Now, it's getting better. And I want to discuss this a little bit because I ultimately think in a lot of cases, I mentioned this before, that it's like you're trying to find something. And why are you trying to find something? If it's so difficult to find and you have to spend so much time looking at it to find it, what exactly is the end game here? And are you setting yourself ultimately for getting nothing? Are you setting yourself up for compromising and losing out on really rare things that you're going to regret later on, that it really didn't matter, and compromising for lesser things that you perceive to be in better condition? I guess this goes back to my old saying that I say that it's a yogiism, that I'd rather own a beautiful doll with a flaw than an ugly doll that's perfect. And so I wonder if we kind of set ourselves up. But I do believe that there is a certain level of psychology involved in this idea. And I want to give you a couple of examples and the reasons why people tend to obsess on condition may not be necessarily obvious in the sense that they are doing it because that's what they are basing their criteria of collecting on. This will make sense more, and I give you examples. The first one is, I call it the lady I found under the table. You're probably wondering, okay, I don't know where this is going, but it was an auction some years back, and we're going back into the 90s now, where we had the exhibit going on, and one of our staff came over and said, Stuart, there's a woman who just climbed underneath one of the tables that has a lot of expensive dolls on top of it. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So I run over there and I lift up the skirt of the table, not the woman, the skirt of the table. And I look, and sure enough, she's down there under the table with lights inside of a head of a doll. And I'm like, ma'am, you can't just pick up the dolls and you're under the table. I need you to please come out from under the table. You could knock over this table or shake it and dolls could fall. So she came out and she said, well, I needed a dark spot to be able to get the light into the head and really see it. I said, okay, but don't go under the table. And so then I looked at her and I said, why are you looking so hard? I mean, the staff member said you've been in there for 5 or 10 minutes. And what exactly are you looking for? So, well, I'm trying to find something wrong with the doll. And I said, well, why? And she said, well, because if I can find something on it, I can probably get it a lot cheaper. And I really want this doll. Now, stop and think about that for a second. So ultimately, a lot of times, people's motivation in this is not exactly what you think it is. It's not because they want to make a decision for themselves on that doll. It's because they're hoping, they're trying to find anything that they will be able to influence it because they really want that doll, and it might be an inroad to them getting it cheaper. And that leads a lot to the next tactic of why people look so hard for problems, and I call it the discounting tactic. And this takes place, I should say, after they buy the doll, either at auction or from anyone or any form of marketplace. They get the doll and they go into full-on inspector mode. And they are absolutely, I hate to use the word tearing the doll apart, but in some cases they are. I mean, they're looking everywhere, desperately trying to find something. And again, for some people, they're just really particular. But for a lot of people, this is a tactic that they're utilizing in hopes of actually finding something. They're desperate to find something, anything, so that they can go back to the person and say, hey, I found this. I paid you this, but I don't think that price is fair now. I need to get that doll discounted. I still want it, but I want it for less. And I know a lot of you have been dealing with this over the years. If you sell on different marketplaces, you'll see this occur all the time. It is a common tactic, and unfortunately, it does work at times with certain people who just resign themselves to accept that they don't want to deal with having to have the doll back and reselling it. But you'd be surprised how many that you say no to. I'm sorry, we can't do that. I understand. Maybe this bothers you, but it's either return the doll or accept the doll. You'll be surprised how many actually will accept it in the end. It's quite common to find that I think the obsession over condition is more related to people trying to affect the market a little bit to make their odds better at getting that doll at a better price. I mean, even when it's noted and it's known, sometimes they want to make sure it's doubly known. So an example of this is the lady who reminded the other bidder of a restoration while bidding against her. So this happened a couple of years ago. It was a really rare French doll, and it was clearly noted in the catalog that it had a small restoration on the bisque of the head. But it was an extremely rare doll, and a lot of people loved this doll and wanted it. So a bidding war ensued and started going up, and eventually ended up with two people going at it. And the one person all of a sudden just yelled out, "Does that other person know it has a restoration?" And so that other bidder was actually affected, was fairly new bidder. They knew it's clearly right there in the catalog, but it was a very disarming moment. And by reiterating it again in such a way, kind of intimidated that person, and they dropped out. So don't be that person. I mean, I know you really want that piece, and I know you want it at a lowest price possible. I get it, but it's not a good look. And allow other collectors to make the decisions themselves. I mean, I tell the story sometimes of a wonderful, prominent collector on the East Coast who has a truly breathtaking collection, amazing collection. And one of the things she heavily focuses on are Izana walkers. And she always tells me the story, and it's an amazing because she started collecting when she was 14. And that was her first encounter with an Izana doll, was at an auction years back. She's in her 60s now. And she found this doll in the auction, fell in love with it. And there were other doll collectors there who recognized it as an Izana as well. And so it was the first time she'd ever bid on a doll at auction, but she really wanted this doll. She was fixated on it. And so it sold. She didn't get it. But then the person who bought it returned the doll because they felt the arm was not in the condition described. And so it was reoffered. And she thought, this is my moment. I can have a chance on this doll. So she started bidding on it. And ultimately, this woman who was sitting next to her, another doll collector, turned to her and said, "I don't know why you're bidding on that doll. That arm is clearly messed up. That's why the person returned it. You don't want that doll." Now, she was young, obviously, 14, and she was a new collector. This was all fresh for her. So she was immediately intimidated by this. And she backed down, and it ended up going really reasonably compared to the first time. And she didn't get that doll. And ultimately now obsesses over that doll since then, determined she will find it. But she's gotten revenge on that moment. And what she made up for in regret is pretty astounding, as she has some amazing Izana walkers. But it shows you trying to intrude on other people's decision-making is not always the best thing because, again, I'm going to go back and say it. Subjectiveness is very much a part of this. So what's that old saying? I forget. Don't yuck on somebody else's yum. She loved that doll. And she obsesses about it today. She can still see it in her mind's eye. And she's determined that one day it will surface and come up and she will be reunited with it, with its little worn arm. So another thing to talk about really are the expectations over time. That is, on particular categories, and, we talked about composition dolls or Madame Alexander dolls in the 50s, and I touched on this a bit, and I want to bring this up one more moment here of conversation over history. As these dolls get older and older and scarcer, will the expectations of the collectors change? I absolutely believe so. We're still in a moment where it's yet to be discovered, but it's only natural that, I don't know, if we take Sissies, for example, by Madame Alexander, that there may be a lessening of expectations on certain ideas of the costume. 30 years from now, 40 years from now, will they be looking for that crispiness in the costume that they kind of expect now and see out on the marketplace? Maybe not, because there's going to be more age to the pieces, obviously, and they're going to be scarcer, more difficult to find. And so collectors will begin to loosen up a little bit of the criteria. So I definitely think time will be a friend to collectors in the sense from the marketplace of loosening expectations. But remember, too, that will probably make your dolls, if you really take care of them of that genre, down the road, even scarcer and more valuable and more sought after when they are pristine. So that leads me to a big question. We do call this the Curious Collector, and I know it's doll-centric, but I like to address things in other collectibles and how they work. So I'm not sure if doll collectors are aware, but when you're going to markets like baseball cards or comic books are two great ones, and I believe coins and stamps as well, you tend to have a system of condition that is decided almost for you in a way. It's far less subjective. And that's because they have gone into a system of grading. Take one example, comic books. There are actually professional grading companies out there that will grade your piece, I think on a scale of 1 to 5, in which you get a certificate on this that you can then keep with that item. And when you go to sell it, you can present that, oh, I have the grading certificate of this and it graded as a 4, which would be really good, or a 5. And I kind of understand it in one sense with those particular pieces, but I don't think it works at all for three-dimensional figurative art for dolls, because ultimately what we talked about, there's so many different mediums, there's so many different nuances within each of those mediums, and they are three-dimensional. Where a comic book, you're talking about a paper product. And so I can see where uniformity in grading can potentially work, but I still have issues with it from the sense of the procedural parts of this, in that a lot of these collectibles, they have like 2 or 3 grading companies out there. And they actually did a study that I read about that was really interesting, where one person sent a baseball card, I think, to 3 different grading companies to have it graded. And it came back with 3 different grades, 1-3, 1-4, 1-5. Because ultimately, when we talk about subjective, those are human beings grading them, working in those companies. They happen to be considered experts in the field and probably are, but there is still naturally, no matter your level of expertise, just because you become an astute expert doesn't necessarily mean you are immune to the subjective aspect of looking at that item and giving it a condition grade, because your grade is going to be potentially different than another expert's grade. And so I find that part of it to be less consistent with the approach of dolls, in that they're even far more subjective and you have so many more mediums. So that's kind of my little Ted's talk on grading in other collectibles and where I see it and why I just don't feel it relates to our particular subject. There are certain aspects of expectations of damages, certainly, that I think are uniform, but ultimately there's a lot more subjectivity in the approach of the collectors in the doll field and the figurative art field than, say, in baseball cards, because they're three-dimensional. We're wrapping it into the end here, and I want to summarize with, how should you inspect a doll? Well, I said it before, start with the positives. The first thing you look at, the presence of that doll. Does it really pop? Does it really stand out? When you walk up and look at that doll, does it go, oh my gosh, my heart is beating fast. I want that piece. It is incredible. That's your number one criteria to start with, the positive. Then you try to reflect on the rarity of that doll. I've searched for this doll for 25 years. This is the first one I've seen. I've wanted this doll for years. This is my bucket list doll. I may never see another one. Or it could take me years to find another one, or I will never find another one with this presence, which is the first. And all of these things go into the rarity part that should be your next criteria in inspection. Then you want to look at the overall presentation of the doll. That is primarily the costume, the body, the size, all of these things. And at that point, then, only then, once you've gone through the positive, do you look for anything that might be an apparent damage. And then, depending on your subjective approach to what bothers you and what doesn't, Tammy mentions the fold on the sock. That one I don't get, but we're going with it. All of these subjective things, you go further to inspect what you require and what you hope for in your dolls. Then, other little things, the little things that I think collectors need to kind of keep in mind when they're looking at the doll. How does it fit in your collection? Is it something completely different? Are you going in another direction? That's okay. But does this doll really fit perfectly in what you have now? And it is the ultimate complement to the dolls in a particular setting that you want to feature it. Vignettes, we talk about vignettes a lot in collecting today, and I'm loving the movement of vignettes, and that is incorporating accessories and furniture and other dolls in a setting that makes the dolls appear more like they are having a soul, more like they have purpose. That is, they are playing off of each other. And you've seen Florence do this for years in the displays we do at the auctions, and you're seeing collectors utilizing this in a lot of their collection displays, and why you're seeing the demand for accessories and furniture being very, very strong, because people want settings. They don't just want soldiers lined up. So does that doll fit perfectly in a vignette? If it has a very, very faint hairline, but it is the absolute one you've been searching for to finish off a particular parlor room setting you're doing with French fashions, hey, that hairline probably has very little meaning at that point, because she's perfect for another reason. So to determine it within your collection, reflect on the ownership of that doll. Stop and think, will you truly love that doll forever? That, to me, supersedes everything else. You own it. You love it. That should be enough right there. And go with those things in the inspection. Go with the positives first. Work your way down the line. Put them all into perspective in your decision making, and you make the decision. Don't let others make it for you. Don't let them come up and tell you, I don't know, I don't think you should buy that. You have to have the courage and the strength to make your own decisions in your collecting, to build the collection that you want to live with. They're not going to live with it. You are. And if you love that piece, don't let them affect you. Which it kind of leads me to another point that I want to say. When you are going to visit collectors, friends, and you go in and you look at their collection and you're admiring some dolls, and then you come to one and there's something about that doll that bothers you, that you don't particularly like on it, or something that you may think is, I don't know, I wouldn't buy it because of that reason. You know, there's no reason to really go into that with that collector, because it could be that collector loves that doll and you're expressing something negative that maybe, again, I'm using this word so much today, but it is an important word that may be subjective to you. Why would you bring that on to them? And especially if they're a new collector or maybe lack a lot of confidence, it could really affect them. And you could take a doll that they have absolutely loved and turn it into something that they keep looking at and thinking about what you said. There's no reason. You're not going to change anything. It's your opinion. They could have bought that doll 15 years ago, so it's not like there's anything they can do at this point. And it kind of ruins the moment. So stop and really reflect onto whether you want to be doing that. Again, don't yuck on other people's yum. Which leads us to my final thought on generally excellent. And I realize this one went on, and I didn't think it would, but, well, you know me, as we joked about it in one of the previous podcasts. One lady said, you're the only man I know who could talk about a carrot for 2 hours. But here we go again with my final thought, and we'll wrap this session up. And that is a discussion on critical thinking, because I think it's an important part of a discussion today in all aspects of collecting, but it especially fits perfectly in the concept of talking about condition. And that is, as collectors, critical thinking becomes a really, really important tool and an art form, in a way, in how you build a collection that is A, great, and B, great for you. And so, you know, more and more in the world today, and I think it's an adjunct to social media, and really more so with the coming of AI, where it seems like determinations are made for us, and we are losing that ability to critically think through our decisions effectively that will fit for our particular needs, in that we're letting other people decide for us. You see it in social media chatter, in group chats and forums, where one collector is telling the other collector they're making a mistake, or they shouldn't do this, or you should do that. I get that. Everybody wants to offer advice, and the internet is just overwhelmed with everybody's advice. But ultimately, what this is leading to is a lot of people are not taking a moment to say, okay, I hear you, just like today. You're listening to me ramble on for over an hour about all of this. I'm not asking you to be a believer. I'm asking you to take what I say and critically think through it and decide for yourself how it works or doesn't work for you. And that should be the way you should approach other people's discussion and talks about condition and how you should inspect a doll and if you should inspect a doll and what you should inspect for in that doll and what level of doll you should expect in your collection or want in your collection, and let them go on. But in the end, take a moment, stop, critically think through it, especially when you get to a particular doll and somebody has an opinion on that doll, but you really love it and you decide you want that doll and it doesn't matter. Kind of going back to that collector with the Isana Walker. She was not able to critically think at that point because she was 14 and a brand new collector and didn't really know much. So I realize it's difficult at that moment, but as you gain knowledge, as you gain confidence, you have to be able to gain the approach of being able to make decisions on your own. So critical thinking is really key in all of this. And I hope is the one takeaway from this whole session that you'll come out and say, yeah, that one I can't argue with him on. Critical thinking is the most important part of every aspect of a collector's career. So that's it. That's my advice to all of you in how I look at conditions and how I look at generally excellent. And as I say, you do you as you're collecting. You do what's fun for you. This should be the joy of your life. This should be the thing that absolutely is a positive and why you should start with the positives always. And you're looking at a doll and what does it say to you? Is it one I want to live with? And then make your decisions from there through your critical thought process and have fun and the happy life of a collector.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.